It is 7 o'clock. Good to have you with us this morning. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, is calling for the UK and other Western powers to provide fighter jets to Ukraine. In a speech this evening, she'll say that the West must be prepared for the long haul and warn that if Vladimir Putin wins, we, that is all of us, would never feel safe again. For its part, Russia is warning Britain of an immediate proportional response if it continues what the Kremlin calls the direct provocation of Ukraine to strike targets inside Russia. In the next few minutes, we'll ask the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, what that might mean. It is Wednesday, the 27th of April.
Go! Let's go, guys, come on.
The battle for the Donbass. Sky News reports from a village on the front line as it comes under fire from Russian forces.
Again, this place has come under attack. They've managed to get everybody out of the village, but we need to leave now too.
Turning off the taps right now. Gas supplies to Poland are cut off by Russia because they refused to pay in rubles. Also ahead, Myanmar's ousted democratic leader Aung San Suu Kyi sentenced to a further 5 years in prison by the military. Plus, the legal requirement for annual MOTs could be axed as part of government plans to tackle the cost of living crisis.
But will it make driving more dangerous? I'm in Dover to find out if drivers here give the plan the green light.
And you'll die a fat, lonely old man. The latest from the defamation trial between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Also ahead on the programme. Making Trafalgar Square even wilder, I'll be speaking to Ray Mears about plans to transform one of London's most iconic landmarks. And I'll later be joined by one of Team GB's Olympic stars, the champion BMX racer Bethany Shriver, who was part of the hat trick of British women recognised at the prestigious Laureus World Sports Awards. Morning all. Heavy weapons, tanks and planes. The Foreign Secretary is urging Western countries to do much more to support Ukraine. In a speech this evening, she'll say that the West must be prepared for the long haul and double down on our support. Russia has already accused NATO of waging a proxy war and has warned Britain that what it calls direct provocation of Ukraine will lead to an immediate proportionate response. We'll have more on that in just a moment. But first, we have a report from the very front line in eastern Ukraine. The Sky News team travelled to the village of Alexandrivka and were there when it came under attack from Russian forces less than a mile away. From there, Sky's Alex Rossi reports.
Along forest roads and across farmland, Ukrainian forces race to fortify the Donbass. Every day brings new fighting, with Russian artillery hitting the small villages on the front line. Black smoulders on the horizon. Eventually, we reach Alexandrivka. Russian forces are about 2 kilometers away, and it's now almost deserted. As we follow, the soldier tells us to use the trees as cover. There are drones above, he warns, and standing in the open here can get you killed.
This is where it landed today. There's smoke over there. You can see the places that are being shelled at the moment, and then one just landed over here. Bistro, bistro.
He shows us a farm. It's too dangerous to go further, he says. It's just been struck. The family escaped, but it soon comes under attack again.
Hi. Go! Let's go, guys, come on. Come on, mate, let's go, let's go. Everyone good? Yeah, everyone's good. Yeah. Get up, guys, let's go. Well, again, this place has come under attack. They've managed to get everybody out of the village, but we need to leave now too.
Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced or trapped by this conflict. The front lines are shifting here all the time. And as Russian forces advance, many villages, like this one, are now in the firing line.
Сразу вывезла отсюда все население, которое даже не хотели, убедили, переговорили, потому что в первую очередь должны убыть отсюда гражданские. Это не их не война, тут были дети, их надо было сразу их эвакуировать.
Nearby, this group of medics takes a break behind the front line. A chance to grab rest and share food under the cover of the woodland. Every day is difficult treating comrades, but they are convinced Putin's forces can be defeated.
Ми тут на своїй землі, нам відступати нема куди. А вони прийшли до нас, вони не... Більшість з них реально не розуміють, що вони тут роблять. Якщо там дето в когось трошки голова працює, вони розуміють, що вони тут вбивці просто і окупанти.
This war is now entering its third month. And as Ukraine reinforces its army in the east with fresh soldiers and new weapons, its army knows the next few weeks will be decisive.
Well, of course, Alex Rossi reporting there from the Donbass. We are hoping to speak to Alex just a little bit later this morning. We will keep our fingers crossed that we can. Well, let's speak now about MOTs. One of those terrible things that we all have to go through once a year, but of course, as part of the government's cost of living crisis cabinet yesterday, Grant Shapps came up with, well, what some people I think will say is quite a decent idea. The government could be axing that annual requirement for MOTs as part of their plans. Let's bring in Madeleine Radcliffe, who's speaking to us today from down in Dover, outside an MOT centre, appropriately enough. What is the thinking behind this? I mean, I can't remember how much I paid the last time I went for an MOT, but it wasn't, you know, £600, £700, which is what my energy bill's going up by.
No, the legal limit for an MOT is £55 for your normal family car, although garages can charge less if they want, and it's every year if you've got a car over 3 years old. So it's not a huge drain on household finances, but the context of this is obviously the government feeling the pressure on the cost of living crisis. Boris Johnson, ahead of cabinet yesterday, put the call out to all his ministers and said, find a way to make save families money and try and alleviate this pressure, this cost of living pressure on them, but without spending more money. So ministers were looking for small tweaks they could make which might shave pounds here and there off household bills, and this is what the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps has come up with. So instead of paying your £55 for a car MOT every year, it would be every 2 years. And that might be a good saving, but there are questions this raises. For a start, if your car is serviced less regularly and drives less efficiently, you're going to end up paying more for fuel, which is, of course, very expensive at the moment. And the AA have pointed out, their head of road policy, Jack Cousins, have pointed out that while it might save money and be well-intentioned, drivers can end up facing far higher bills for repairs in between those MOTs, besides the fact that there are road safety concerns, and indeed it could put jobs in garages like this at risk if people are required to do these tests less often. The AA also pointed out that it was only recently that the government were looking at making MOTs biannual instead, and they moved away from that idea because of road safety fears. And polling at the time done by the AA suggested that the vast majority of drivers actually support this annual checkup for their cars. It makes them feel safer and more secure. So whether the cost of living crisis has actually changed drivers' minds on this, we'll see. The next step, though, is this will be considered by Boris Johnson as to whether to put this into practice.
Madeleine, thanks very much indeed. Well, you saw his report from the east of Ukraine just a couple of moments ago. Let's speak now to the reporter and the head of the team responsible, Alex Rossi, joining us from Kramatorsk in the east of the country this morning. Good to see you, Alex. Some incredible reporting, some very, very scary scenes for you and the team. But the one takeaway from your report this morning, those that you are with on the Ukrainian side feel they can defeat Vladimir Putin in the east.
Good morning, Neil. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. The takeaway from all of this is that the Russian advance is starting. It's fairly slow. We've had some information in the last couple of hours that the village that we were in, Alexandrivka, has now been taken by Russian forces. We saw the beginning of that attack. The Ukrainian soldiers there that we spoke to, they managed to evacuate those places. Now, there is a patchwork of these small farming type villages across the line of contact at the moment, which is moving south from those Russian positions. They did manage to get people out, but it is moving forward. But that said, the Russians are at risk from a counterattack, a Ukrainian counterattack. We saw a large number of Ukrainian soldiers. We also saw quite a lot of heavy weaponry as well, and they are very confident that they can win this war, particularly, of course, with the support that they are getting. Many countries around the world are now sending in heavy weapons to this area to try to stop that Russian invasion in its tracks. Now, they are also buoyed because they've seen the botched Russian offensive in the north of the country. Down here where I am in the Donbass, they're also familiar with this enemy. They're familiar with the tactics. This is a war that, remember, has been running now one way or another since 2014, so for 8 years. But of course, the big fear is for people still trapped where I am, and it seems that the Russian forces are trying to encircle the Donbass in a kind of pincer movement to cut off Ukrainian forces. These are some of the most skilled and experienced Ukrainian soldiers, but there are quite a few civilians still trapped here, and the fear, of course, is that they will get caught in the crossfire of this fighting.
Alex, you and the team keep the head down. For now, thanks very much indeed. Our political correspondent Tamara Cohen is here on a related topic. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, making an important speech tonight. One of the takeaways from that which I've read is, once again, we are hearing senior politicians within the government re-emphasising the fact this is not coming to an end anytime soon.
That is absolutely her message. This is the Mansion House speech that she's giving tonight in the centre of London, and saying that if Ukraine is to win, and she calls that a strategic imperative for us all, then the West needs a far tougher approach. And she sets out 3 ways of doing that. 1, more defence spending. She says the 2% of GDP target should be a floor, not a ceiling, although, of course, the government recently decided not to spend any more in its budget. The second part is cutting off Russian oil and gas once and for all. And the third is, of course, deepening relationships with other democracies. But Liz Truss will be warning that this is a long haul. I'll read you a bit of what she's going to be saying in this speech. She says, we need a new approach, one that melds hard security and economic security, builds stronger global alliances, and where free nations are more assertive and self-confident. One that recognises we're seeing the return of geopolitics. We cannot be complacent. The fate of Ukraine remains in the balance. And let's be clear, if Putin succeeds, there will be untold further misery across Europe and terrible consequences across the globe. We would never feel safe again. So we must be prepared for the long haul and double down on our support for Ukraine. Heavy weapons, tanks, aeroplanes, digging deep into our inventories, ramping up production. We need to do all of this. You'll notice she talks about aeroplanes. Of course, that's something Ukraine has repeatedly asked for. They want warplanes to try and bomb some of the Russian weaponry. The problem has been that they have to come from neighbouring countries, and they don't want to take that risk of escalating the conflict. If that were to happen, if they were to make that come off, then, of course, the levels of confrontation with Russia would ratchet up considerably.
Tamara, for now, thanks very much indeed. Plenty more, of course, on Ukraine throughout the programme. But let's turn our attention to this story. Police are searching for missing mother of 2, Katie Kenyon, and have arrested a man on suspicion of murder. Sky's Fraser Maud is in Burnley for us this morning with the latest. Fraser, good to see you. Not what anyone wanted to hear from the police. This now a murder investigation.
Well, the search will continue today. The police yesterday announced that the 50-year-old man that they had arrested initially on suspicion of kidnap had been rearrested on suspicion of murder, and of course that will have come as a devastating blow to Katie Kenyon's family. There was a statement issued yesterday evening from Lancashire Police's head of major crime saying, "While I hold some slim hope that Katie may still be found alive, I'm sad to say that Katie has now been missing for over 4 days. Despite extensive police inquiries and appeals, we've not found Katie, nor have there been any sightings of Katie." He goes on to say, "We've spoken to Katie's family and they are understandably extremely upset by this latest development, and I have officers continuing to offer them support. My thoughts are with them at this time." So this is now a murder investigation. There have been some 60 people assisting in the search for Katie in this area around Gisborne Woods. It's a huge area for them to search. It's around 3,000 acres, over 4.5 square miles of densely wooded area that they are searching at the moment. 60 people taking part in that search. They've had aerial support, the support from police forces from Wales, from Merseyside, from Lancashire and from Greater Manchester Police, as well as the Poland Mountain Rescue Team. Dog teams have been in the area as well, casualty dogs, trying to find any trace of Katie. And as the police say, that it seems now that their belief is that the hopes are now fading of finding Katie alive, although her family will still be clinging on to the fact that the police say they believe there is still a slim chance that she could be found alive. But this is an extremely difficult type of terrain to search. The area that is in question here, a huge area, densely wooded, as I say, and in the past 15 years or so, there have been a couple of previous searches by police in areas similar to this, and they have taken days, weeks, even months, and on occasion have not been successful at all. So this is a very difficult task facing the police. They are still questioning a 50-year-old man who's been arrested on suspicion of murder, and it would seem that any hope of finding Katie quickly may well rest on their questioning of that man and whether he is unable or unwilling to give them any further information as to where she might be.
Fraser, back to you just as soon as there is any news. For now, thanks very much indeed. But let's get more reaction to the latest developments in Ukraine and indeed a policy announcement on his own brief. The Justice Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, joins us in the studio. Good to see you this morning, Mr.
Good morning.
I do promise we will get to your brief in a few minutes' time, but there is an awful lot around Ukraine we need to discuss. We heard yesterday the US Secretary of Defence, Lloyd Austin, saying that Ukraine believes it can win the war. We've just been speaking to our correspondent in the Donbass, saying that forces there believe they can win the war. Boris Johnson, when he was in India, struck a note of caution, suggesting that Russia might win. Are we the voice of reason in all of this? Or perhaps is Boris Johnson just parking some of the boosterism when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, I think we want to show maximum solidarity to Ukraine, but it's clear that the conflict is in the balance. I've said since the first time I came on Sky News, I didn't think it would be over in weeks, possibly not even in months. So we need the strategic stamina and staying power, and I think the Prime Minister is very conscious of that. So we keep ramping up the pressure on Putin through the sanctions. We keep supporting as best we can with military hardware and other support the Ukrainians, and we do the most we can to deter Putin's behaviour. I spoke to the ICC prosecutor yesterday. We're rallying countries to support the investigation, not just because we want to see justice done for any war crimes. We want to send a deterrent message now to those commanders in the field that if they commit war crimes, they'll end up behind bars.
But just to pick up on something, as you yourself admit, you've said before, not over in weeks and months. You know, we could potentially be looking into the years, certainly over 12 months in terms of our involvement. Liz Truss, your colleague, the Foreign Secretary, is making a really important speech later on today in which she's going to suggest that 2% NATO spending target on defence should be the floor, not the ceiling. I mean, just in terms of the length of the mission with our current spending, how sustainable is it for the UK and other nations to keep sending arms with the tempo that we already have?
Well, that's why we need the strategic stamina. We're one of the few countries that meets the NATO target. And I think there's long been this argument, and you've heard it from successive American administrations, that some European countries need to step up to the plate. We agree with that. And at the same time, we need to think, if this is going to last months, possibly years, how we keep supporting at the right pace the Ukrainian resistance, which has been...
Sorry to interrupt, but it sounds like you kind of agree with Liz Truss. I mean, when she refers to 2% as the floor, not the ceiling, it certainly suggests that Liz Truss is minded to see a significant increase in defence spending here. And that view is not universally held around the cabinet table, as I understand it.
Well, no, we've seen a massive increase in defence spending. The Chancellor and the Defence Secretary work very closely under the leadership of the Prime Minister on that. Obviously, we've got a cost of living crisis. We need to cut our coat according to our cloth overall. But actually, the direction of travel has been to boost and change the nature of our defences because, of course, and you can see this in Ukraine, you can see this in terms of Russia as an adversary. It's not just conventional warfare we're seeing. We've also got cyber misinformation. We need to adapt to that. That's exactly what the Chancellor and Defence Secretary have done.
But the Chancellor didn't do it at the last opportunity that he did have, did he, in the spring statement? Not by my recollection.
No, but we just had a spending review. Mm-hmm. We had a strategic defence review, an integrated review in foreign policy. That was absolutely the right time to take a long-term forward look, and the Chancellor absolutely, along with the Defence Secretary, addressed this there.
Just in terms, though, of what we are hearing from the Russians, by my measure, I think this is the first time that Russia has made a direct threat against the United Kingdom. Yesterday, James Heapy, your colleague at the MOD, said it was completely legitimate for Ukraine to seek out Russian targets to disrupt their logistics. The Russians have responded saying, well, if you do that, if you keep encouraging them, you now become a legitimate target. What do you feel about that?
Well, the Russian statement is unlawful and what we're doing is lawful. International law is very clear on this. We're entitled, all states are entitled, to provide military support to any state exercising the right of lawful defence against an aggressive invasion. And frankly, if Russia starts threatening other countries, it only adds further to their pariah status and will only further the, if you like, solidarity and the consensus of the international community that they must be stopped.
Just briefly, you can. We've heard this morning Poland has had the gas cut off. We would assume, therefore, that Bulgaria will follow quickly, will quickly follow suit. What can we do to assist them? Because it does look like Poland is going to be in an awful lot of trouble without that kind of energy.
Well, I mean, first of all, we need to show solidarity. Mm-hmm. Clearly, what we are seeing is the need to wean ourselves off reliance on Russia. We've obviously got very low reliance on gas from Russia. I think it's around 3%, though some European countries are in a different position. We have been warning about this for a while, but yes, we'll stand shoulder to shoulder with our Polish friends and allies. They've said that they can deal with this, but of course it will have a very damaging effect on Russia as well, because it is becoming further and further, more and more, not just a political pariah, but an economic pariah. And that will put the squeeze ultimately on Vladimir Putin. But one thing is true and clear. We cannot allow his bullying behaviour, whether it's economic warfare or it's military warfare, to succeed.
Can we just briefly then return to the Mail on Sunday article about Angela Rayner? Now, we understand that the whips have been taking a look into all of this. I mean, here's the piece itself. I mean, I probably don't even need to ask what your response is to the piece itself. I think I probably know, but...
No, it's terrible. And I go up occasionally against Angela Rayner in my position as Deputy Prime Minister. She's a formidable opponent. I respect her entirely, and I can't stand this kind of thing.
So have the whips gotten anywhere closer to who was responsible for all of this? Well,
I'd need to speak to the Chief Whip about this. It's something that he will be looking at, and of course it's very difficult to find, but what we're clear is that we don't tolerate, we will not tolerate any behaviour and smear like this, and if we can find out, we will take action against it.
I wonder, though, what you make of the editor of the Mail on Sunday's refusal to attend that meeting. He was invited by the Speaker of the House of Commons, and the Daily Mail today being rather punchy, I have to say, about it. No, Mr. Speaker, they're invoking freedom of the press. I suppose the other view in all of this is what was to be lost by turning up at the Speaker's office and having a conversation about this?
Look, I think whether it's the Speaker or the newspaper editors, we all believe in two things. One, the power and the importance of free speech, but secondly, the importance of not allowing that to be abused and used to spread sexism in any shape or form.
Should he have turned up, though?
I'm not going to second-guess the decision-makers by decisions of editors.
Okay, should the Common Speaker then have invited him?
I think it was a legitimate thing for Lindsay Hoyle to do to invite him, and of course it's the prerogative of any editor to decide how they treat that invitation.
Everyone yesterday at Cabinet was asked to come up with some bright ideas for the cost of living crisis. I'm just wondering what yours were, sitting at the head of the Justice Department.
Well, look, I don't comment on the detail of what we discuss in Cabinet, but I think there's a whole range of things that we're looking at. First of all, we've got a £22 billion package to deal with the cost of living. But this Prime Minister and this Chancellor are going to be absolutely assiduous and relentless in looking at what more we can do. We're providing rebates on council tax, on energy bills. We've got this pot of money that local authorities can use to target the most vulnerable. But we, look, as is well known, we discussed childcare. One of the things, there's lots of former housing ministers around the Cabinet table. We discussed housing costs. These are all areas where we're never going to stop. We're going to continue unflinchingly to look at what more we can do. And the reason being is we understand the pressure that families up and down the country are under.
But do you understand the kind of the knee-jerk response when, the papers are carrying stories that Grant Shapps' big, bright idea was, making annual MOT tests come, biannually. Torsten Bell from the Resolution Foundation says if this is the answer, then the government has lost the plot. I suppose the problem for you is if you have all these individual policies and you bring them together and you total them up, then eventually it may well be that we see that the cost of living crisis ameliorated somewhat. But there's no one big measure like the Labour Party has, the windfall tax, which would see an immediate kind of cash injection into
Well, first of all, I don't agree in terms of the characterisation of the Conservative policies. The UC taper saves the relevant families £1,000 a year. If you look at what we've done on the national living wage, that saves £1,000 a year for those eligible full-time workers. And frankly, if you look at Labour's policy, you asked about it, of a windfall tax, that would damage investment in energy supplies we need and hike bills. It's disastrous. It's not serious. So what this shows is they're coming up with, frankly, ill-thought-through policies, but we have got a plan, a concerted plan, and I think that's what voters want to see.
Minister, I am nothing if not a man of your word, so let's talk about your brief. And one has to say, a fairly significant announcement about the way we tackle radicalisation within our prisons. Tell us more.
So, look, the changing threat from terrorism evolves all the time, but it's also evolving in prisons. Why? Because we're locking up more terrorists and extremists than ever before. 200 prisoners convicted of terrorist offences, another 200 prisoners who've got terrorist links. Jonathan Hall has conducted this independent report. We accept it pretty much in full, and we got to do more to prevent extremists tainting the well. Let me give you two brief illustrations. Sure. One, we must nip in the bud far earlier the kind of coercive controlling behaviour by extremists which can lead to radicalisation and terrorism. Just to give a concrete example, of course we want to respect the right for prisoners to be able to eat halal, prepare food halal, but they can't have no-go areas in kitchens for those who don't respect or comply with their rules. Secondly, we've got these separation centres which are used to isolate the most dangerous radicalising recruiters of terrorists. We need to probably make greater use of that, so I'm beefing up the money to target those offenders who need to be removed. And finally, we'll need this Bill of Rights to replace the Human Rights Act to stop the legal attrition that we're already starting to see with terrorists and extremists claiming a right to socialise within prison when what actually they want to do is radicalise.
Sounds to me that last part is the most important part in all of this. If the kind of the mantra that we hear from government about activist lawyers is true, and you would certainly expect when you start bringing in some of these changes for there to be challenges all the way to the Supreme Court.
Well, we've already had it. We've got a number of cases. We've had to, it's cost us £500,000 to defend these cases. We've not been taken to court yet. But what I want to do is put the policies in place to protect the public. I think we have allowed understandable cultural and religious sensitivities to deter us, as Jonathan Hall sets out. And, of course, what the Bill of Rights will do is, while respecting our fundamental freedoms, make sure we've got the common-sense balance, and in this context, allowing prison governors to take the action they need to retain the security in the prison, but also to protect the public from these very dangerous people.
Dominic Raab, great to have you in the studio. Thanks for being with us. Shall we have a quick look at the papers? And, of course, plenty about Ukraine in there. Russia has threatened strikes against Western targets. That's the lead in the Times. It says the Kremlin is ready to retaliate after remarks by the UK's Armed Forces Minister that Ukraine attacking targets in Russia was completely legitimate. Crunch time in the Crunch Time UK. That's the lead story in the Metro. It reports that most people are already cutting back on spending and dipping into their savings as the cost of living crisis bites. Meanwhile, the Eye says solutions being considered, including, as discussed with Mr Rabb, the annual MOT test on cars and cutting the cost of childcare. Now, the ousted leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, has been sentenced to another 5 years in prison by the military. Let's speak now to Sky's Asia correspondent, Tom Cheshire, who has more on this. Tom, explain exactly what is going on here. We've known that the military government there has had it in for Aung San Suu Kyi for quite some time.
Yeah, even before she was elected as leader, democratically elected as leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi spent a long time under house arrest. Now, since the military overthrew that government in February last year, she has been detained. She's faced a series of trials. The ones before this were less serious. They were over possessing walkie-talkies and breaking COVID regulations. They still handed her a 6-year sentence for that. But this was a corruption case, the first of 10 charges she faces, and they found her guilty of that and sentenced her today to 5 years in prison. Now, her lawyers haven't been able to speak to the media. This trial has been held behind closed doors. So her supporters will say this is a determined effort to keep her away from politics yet again. This sentence means she won't be able to run in the elections that the military promise will happen by the end of next year. And she faces a further 10 corruption charges, which could see her spend the rest of her life, she's 76, in prison. And she's not the only one facing these sorts of cases. Members of her party have also been arrested. More than 13,000 people detained in Myanmar, according to human rights groups. So that shows what looks like a concerted effort by the military to keep its hold on power. But at the same time, those sorts of numbers suggest the scale of the opposition they are still facing in Myanmar. There is a lot of opposition, sometimes military conflict throughout the country.
Tom, for now, many thanks indeed. Still to come on the programme, P&O have set sail again from Dover this morning, but I'll be speaking to the National Secretary of the RMT Union, Darren Proctor, about that ship that stalled yesterday. Welcome back. A reminder as to our top stories. And the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, has told the programme that Russia's threat of an immediate, proportionate response to what it calls the UK's provocation of Ukraine is unlawful and would add to its pariah status. Russian gas supplies to Poland have resumed again this morning after they were cut off because Poland refused to pay in rubles. And MOTs could be axed as part of government plans to tackle the cost of living crisis. Well, in the last few minutes, Dominic Raab told me the UK will stand shoulder to shoulder with countries like Poland and Bulgaria who've been threatened by Russia. He also condemned statements that Russia has made about the UK as unlawful.
International law is very clear on this. We're entitled, all states are entitled, to provide military support to any state exercising the right of lawful defence against an aggressive invasion. And frankly, if Russia starts threatening other countries, it only adds further to their pariah status and will only further the, if you like, solidarity and the consensus of the international community that they must be stopped.
Tamara back with us. Tell us more about the interview with Dominic Raab. What did you make of it?
So this is on the point that Liz Truss will be making this big speech tonight about how we need to send heavier weaponry, including tanks and warplanes to Ukraine. And even with that, it could still be a very long haul for Ukraine to actually triumph in this conflict. He was saying, first of all, that if this whole idea of sending tanks and warplanes has been discussed a lot and not come off because they have to come from the neighbouring countries who have the Soviet-era tanks and warplanes that Ukraine wants, and then backfilled by Western countries, giving probably Poland some of those tanks and warplanes. And they haven't wanted to take the risk because it would have to be a unilateral decision. It couldn't be a NATO decision. And so he says that this, if Russia was to threaten a country which did that, then, the West would come to their aid. But clearly, whatever guarantees were needed in that situation haven't been there as yet. But he sounded, and Liz Truss sounds hopeful that it could happen down the line. As to defence spending here, he says the UK is one of the few countries that meets the 2% target. But she's saying that that should be a floor and not a ceiling. And I think there's an interesting cabinet division on this. Liz Truss clearly pushing for far more defence spending than we have at the moment, but others, notably the Chancellor, not doing that last month in the budget because, of course, you spend more on defence, you have to spend less elsewhere, and there are, of course, huge other priorities after COVID, not least the NHS and getting through the backlog.
Yeah, a lot on his plate as well. Tamara, for now, thanks very much indeed. Now, the first P&O freight ferry has left the port of Dover to Calais since the company sacked 800 workers and replaced them with cheaper agency staff. Joining us now, Darren Proctor, National Secretary of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union. Darren, good to see you this morning. I hope you're well. I just wonder if we can start with, of course, P&O and the ferry sailing yesterday. I saw you quoted this morning in the papers. What's your understanding as to exactly what went wrong?
My understanding is that the vessel was partway across from point A to point B, and the engines failed. That there was a blackout on board the vessel, and it was left, just floating about in the sea for 2 hours. There was distress calls put out. RNLI were called to the vessel. There was the Queen Victoria was standing by on for assistance, and he was tugged there. And this is exactly what we said would happen. When you sack your entire workforce, you're getting rid of the skills, the knowledge, the experience on board those vessels. And seafarers can go from one vessel to another, but knowing the intricacies and being familiar with the the operation on board, with the technical aspect of the job. And this was clearly something that was demonstrated yesterday. When a problem arose, they didn't know how to deal with it.
I mean, Dan, from what you're saying, and given the inexperience of these staff, I mean, are you saying it's a matter of when and not if we see further problems with another P&O ferry?
100%. I've said this week that, there's going to be blood on the hands of those individuals that are allowing these vessels to sail. And at some point going forward, all the interviews that we've given over the last 4 weeks in relation to safety will be used in some form of an investigation. And we want a proactive approach to safety. We've identified that there's problems, individuals working on board a vessel for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for 17 weeks. They're not going to be, of the mindset that they should be or that they would be in week 1 or week 2. And when you're bringing individuals in who don't know the systems, when a seafarer joins a vessel, particularly in the engine room, they would start off at the lower grades. They would have the experience to rely upon of the senior individuals. They would become familiarised with all the various systems on board. And, I've heard people say that it's a coincidence and blackouts happen. Blackouts do happen, but very, very, they're rectified very, very quickly. And I spoke to some of my colleagues on social media last night who are, seafarers, and I asked them to give me some examples of timelines. And they said to me, one individual, he's been at sea 50 years, he's blacked out, he thinks 6 times, and it was put back on no more than 30 seconds later. Here we have a vessel, aimlessly drifting for 2 hours.
Where are we then, Darren, as regards the 800 staff that were summarily sacked by P&O? I remember Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, on this programme and others, talking a very good game about how the government would be holding P&O to account for all of this. Has that transpired? No,
it's not transpired. They have talked a very good game. It's become a little bit more, not more than a waffle shop, to be honest. And we want them to step up. They're talking about bringing in a fair ferries framework that will ensure that the ferry sector in the UK will have decent employment, safe jobs, quality jobs. But we've not yet seen that. All we've seen is the 9-point plan being rolled out and nothing more since then. So we're calling on them to, we want actions, not words. And hopefully we'll see something this week. But we'll continue to demonstrate, and if we need to, roll further out them demonstrations to other ports, then we will.
When P&O ferries say that their business model doesn't work if they continue to employ people on the same conditions that they had previously, what is your response to that?
Well, you look at other ferry operators in the UK and you have to ask yourself why they are able to operate. And you have to look at the amount of directors, the amount of management that they have in place. This is not down to the seafarers. So there's good operators in this country who are able to run and pay decent wages to UK seafarers and operate vessels safely. This has been, mismanagement over a number of years. We've questioned P&O going back a number of years. What is their market and what is their target audience? Because we've seen that their market, if you like, particularly in Hull, where they were offering passengers a ticket for 2 nights, accommodation on board for £35. And that can't be sustained. So you have to look at what they've done in terms of the marketability of P&O ferries, as opposed to blaming the seafarers and cutting their jobs for systematic failures at management level.
Dan Proctor from the RMT, good to see you this morning. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, a clinical psychologist has diagnosed Amber Heard with borderline personality disorder in day 9 of the ongoing defamation trial with Johnny Depp. Mr. Depp is suing his ex-wife for libel over a 2018 article she wrote in the Washington Post, alleging she was physically and sexually abused. She is countersuing. Our correspondent Shingi Maruriki reports.
Johnny Depp and Amber Heard once walked down the aisle together, but they're now facing off in court in a real-life Hollywood legal drama. Depp is suing her for $50 million for a 2018 opinion piece she wrote about domestic violence, which actually doesn't mention the actor. She's countersuing for $100 million. And yesterday, the court heard more about their disputes, one of which was seen firsthand by the estate manager of Depp's private island, who spoke via video call.
You could hear inside the house yelling, Amber yelling and Johnny answering back, and you could really hear what was being said. Amber was telling him that he was a washed-up actor. He was going to die a fat, lonely old man.
The spotlight then shifted to Heard's mental state. A Depp witness concluded she had multiple personality disorders, traits she said often spiral into attempts to avoid being abandoned.
The results of Ms. Heard's evaluation supported 2 diagnoses: borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder.
She also cast doubt on Heard's claim she suffered PTSD, symptoms the actress maintains were caused by her relationship with Depp.
I very specifically was assessing to determine whether post-traumatic stress disorder was present, and it was not.
We've heard from Depp and an array of witnesses, but Heard has not had her chance to respond. She's set to testify later in the trial. Shingi Marurike, Sky News.
Coming up after the break, I'll be looking ahead to the Foreign Secretary's keynote speech on global security with the chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, after this. Welcome back. A little later today, the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, will call for a reboot of the world's approach to tackling Russian acts of aggression, such as we've seen in Ukraine. Well, let's take you through the latest activity on the ground there. It's estimated that 2,000 troops and 1,000 civilians are still holed up in bunkers underneath the Azov-style steelworks in Mariupol. Within the past 24 hours in Transnistria, a breakaway region of Moldova beside the Ukrainian border, several explosions, believed caused by rocket-propelled grenades, hit the territory's Ministry of State Security. Well, yesterday, Russia intensified its aerial attacks on eastern Ukraine as it continues its refocused campaign to take over the Donbass region. Moscow claims to have hit dozens of military targets in the area. Joining us now, the chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. Mr. Ellwood, good to have you on the programme again. Liz Truss is set to argue for a reboot in global security today. What needs to be changed? What needs to improve?
Well, I'm really pleased to see Britain in this tradition of playing a role on the international stage leaning into this because the state of our international institutions is dire. They have served us well since their creation after the Second World War, but they're no longer able to hold errant nations to account. The United Nations, for example, the Security Council is paralyzed because of that veto that China and Russia exploits on a regular basis. So indeed, their weakness is actually being taken advantage of by Russia and China. And so I want to see Britain play an important role in their upgrade, in advancing what these international institutions do, particularly the World Trade Organization as well. But the second aspect is also, I hope that she'll focus on, is asking ourselves, what are we trying to achieve in Ukraine? This conflict is continuing to drag on as such. We're pouring more weapon systems in. Quality and quantity is going up. But to what end? The unanswered question I hope the Foreign Secretary will address is, what are we collectively trying to achieve? What is mission success? Given the threat from Putin is not just in Ukraine, but well beyond that, that is game-changing, what we're experiencing here in European security. Putin must strategically fail in Ukraine. And if we allow him to survive, he will regroup and attempt to advance his sphere of influence way beyond Ukraine in the future. So we need to be very, very clear what our mission is. It must be to push Russia completely out of the Donbass region. That, for me, is what success looks like. It defines our overall strategy. It then determines the tactics. And then, of course, the subsequent weapon systems and training that then need to come into play. That starts to look like a plan.
Given the scale of Russian forces, though, given the furious fighting that we have seen in the east of the country, if Ukraine is to win in the Donbass, it's not going to happen in the next couple of weeks, is it? It will require a sustained effort from the West. And Liz Truss's comments about, other NATO member countries perhaps upping their contributions to defence spending and hitting that 2% target, you can kind of see where she's going with that argument.
I can, and this is why we require international statecraft. We need to coordinate the activities. The might of NATO is far more formidable than the Russian forces itself. We are now involved in a proxy war. We can't deny that. I am concerned by General Mark Milley, the chair of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, who gave an ominous warning yesterday to say time is not on Ukraine's side. The outcome of the battle will be determined by Western support given to Ukraine. So we need to look carefully at what we can do to upgrade our support for Ukraine so they can push back Russian forces out of the entire Donbass region.
Speaking very specifically, though, about the UK, currently defence spending between, I think, 2.1 to 2.3% of GDP. I mean, is there not an argument for the United Kingdom reinvesting in its military, reinvesting significant in its military, perhaps pushing up to closer to 3%?
I think I've made this point on your programme many times, that we are still on a peacetime budget setting of around 2%. But look what we're doing, quite rightly, supporting Ukraine with training, now with taskings and personnel involved in Europe that were never planned for. These threats were, I think, acknowledged that they were coming over the horizon. They have now landed. And as I say, this is a turning point in European security. We need to recognise, and I hear this call, but other departments will say, no, I need money as well. But if you don't look after your security, you then become vulnerable. Our economy becomes vulnerable. Our prosperity is affected. And then there's no money for any of the departments, let alone defence. It's important that the Treasury number 10 recognises we not only need to improve our statecraft to match the Cold War settings in our confidence in standing up to Russia, but also our armed forces, our security, our entire defence posture needs to improve.
Mr. Niall, before we let you go, perhaps just a word on the possible accession of Finland to NATO. Plenty of people can understand the rationale for it, particularly if you're living in Finland right now. But we do know that there will be, according to the Russians, a proportionate response, which, to my eyes, means military build-up in that particular part of the world. How sanguine are you about that?
Well, we need to, I think, distance ourselves from the rhetoric that comes out of the Kremlin, which is designed to scare us, designed to spook us, designed to make us think again. NATO is very much a defensive alliance. If Finland feel threatened, if the people in Finland want to join NATO, that is their right. And absolutely, it would be important for NATO to include them in this alliance. It will, I think, almost double the actual borderline between NATO and Russia itself. That is something that Russia will have to come to terms with, but we shouldn't cede to Russian aggression and allow Russia to exploit our weakness, which is exactly what Putin has been doing.
Tobias Elwood, great to have you on the programme this morning. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's continue to monitor events in Ukraine. Some debate about what is happening with Russia's gas supply to both Poland and Bulgaria. The latest that we know is it has at least been shut off for a time. We'll continue to monitor events there. But we will be back to our correspondents in and around Ukraine, particularly those in the Donbass. We've seen the violence. We'll bring it to you next.